If there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that desperation makes you ignore red flags. And let me tell you, there were plenty of them when I walked into that Walmart for my first shift. But bills don't pay themselves. And at the time, I figured the no refund sign that was nailed to the employee break room wall was just a quirky little joke. I was wrong. Very wrong. Let me back up. My name is Rachel Thomas, and I wasn't always this frazzled. Just a few months ago, I had a normal life. I was working at a small-town newspaper as a copy editor, living paycheck to paycheck but satisfied with my little corner of the world. Then the paper shut down, and everything fell apart. Unemployment checks barely kept the lights on, and the landlord wasn't interested in hearing about my career in transition. Before we dive deeper into this nightmare, hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for more chilling stories that will keep you up at night. You won't want to miss the twists and turns ahead. I tried for weeks to find another job. Every application went unanswered, and every interview ended with a polite smile and a "we'll be in touch." My savings drained fast, leaving me with no choice but to take the first job that said yes. Walmart, night shift, stocking shelves. It wasn't glamorous, but it was money, and I told myself I could handle a few graveyard shifts. Besides, what could possibly go wrong at a 24-hour superstore? The first thing that struck me as odd was the smell. The Walmart was nestled on the outskirts of town, surrounded by acres of nothing. When I arrived for orientation, I noticed how stale the air felt inside, almost like it had been trapped there for decades. Beneath the chemical tang of floor cleaner and faint whiff of fryer grease from the long-shuttered McDonald's in the corner, there was something else. Something sour, like damp cardboard left to rot. As I stepped through the automatic doors, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow on the aisles. It felt colder than it should have been. The air conditioning cranked too high for a winter evening. My breath fogged slightly as I exhaled, which didn't make sense. I glanced around for someone to check in with, but the store felt empty. Not just quiet. Empty. No customers wandering the aisles, no cashiers at the registers, no employees in their blue vests chatting by the customer service desk. It was just me. Hello. My voice echoed down the cavernous aisles, bouncing off the stacks of canned goods and towers of boxed electronics. A man emerged from the back of the store, his steps slow and deliberate. He was tall and wiry, with thinning gray hair and a name tag that read Todd, manager. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You must be Rachel," he said, his voice gravelly but pleasant. "Welcome aboard." His handshake was cold, his palm dry and papery. "Thanks," I said, trying to match his energy, though something about his gaze made my skin prickle. "Where's everyone? It's so quiet." Todd chuckled, the sound low and humorless. "You'll get used to it. Night shifts aren't for everyone. Most people don't like what they see in the dark." I frowned, unsure how to respond. Todd led me to the break room, a small, windowless space with a flickering overhead light. The walls were a dull beige, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. There was a vending machine stocked with snacks that looked like they hadn't been restocked since the 90s, and a small table littered with coffee-stained employee manuals. That's when I saw the sign, "No refunds." It was written in thick, black marker on a piece of cardboard and nailed crookedly to the wall. Beneath it, someone had scratched something into the paint. The letters were jagged and uneven, as if carved in a hurry. "They never leave." I stared at it, a shiver running down my spine. "Don't mind that," Todd said, noticing my gaze. "Some of the employees like to mess around. You know how it is." I nodded slowly, though I wasn't convinced. My first assignment was in the toy section. The aisles were crammed with brightly colored boxes and plastic-wrapped action figures. The shelves felt too tall, looming over me like they might collapse at any moment. As I stocked boxes of board games, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone peering at me from the other end of the aisle. But there was never anyone there. Then came the noises. It started as a faint rustling, like the sound of plastic being crumpled. I paused, holding my breath, but the sound stopped. I tried to convince myself it was just the building settling, or maybe the HVAC kicking on. But as the minutes dragged on, the noises grew louder. Footsteps, the soft thud of something heavy hitting the floor. I moved cautiously toward the sound, my heart hammering in my chest. At the end of the aisle, I found a doll lying face down on the floor. Its porcelain face was cracked, one glassy eye staring up at me. The box it had come from was still sealed on the shelf. By the time my first break rolled around, I was jittery and on edge. I headed back to the break room, eager to shake off the creeping unease that clung to me. The room was empty except for a young man sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone. He was skinny, with messy black hair and a name tag that read, Jeremy. "You're new," he said without looking up. "Yeah," I replied, grabbing a bottle of water from my bag. "First night," he snorted. "Good luck." I frowned, but before I could ask what he meant, the lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, Jeremy was staring at me intently, his expression unreadable. "You hear them yet?" he asked. "Hear who?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stood, tucking his phone into his pocket, and left the room without another word. The second half of my shift was worse. Every aisle I entered felt wrong, like the air was heavier, pressing down on me. The shelves seemed taller, the shadows longer. More toys appeared on the floor. Cars, stuffed animals, even a bicycle. At one point, I heard a faint whisper, so soft I almost missed it. "Rachel." I froze, my blood running cold. It wasn't possible. I was alone in the store. "Rachel," the voice said again, louder this time. It was coming from the next aisle over. Slowly, I crept toward the sound, my footsteps hesitant. As I rounded the corner, I saw a figure standing at the far end of the aisle. It was Todd, his back to me, his posture unnaturally stiff. "Todd?" I called out, my voice shaking. He didn't move. "Todd, are you okay?" Still no response. I took a step closer, and that's when I saw it. In the reflective surface of a hanging display of mirrors, Todd's face wasn't his own. It was hollowed out, his eyes sunken and empty, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. The reflection turned to look at me, even though Todd's body remained motionless. "Welcome to the night shift," it whispered. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. When I looked again, Todd was gone. The aisle was empty, and that's when I realized this wasn't just a job, it was a trap. The store was always quiet, but never silent. The air felt thick, as though something was pressing down on it, making everything feel heavier, more suffocating. The sound of my footsteps echoed as I walked through the aisles, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above me, like a constant hum in the background. It wasn't unpleasant, but it wasn't comforting either. It was simply there, filling the space, never changing, never stopping. The monotony wrapped around me like a second skin, and it felt like it had always been this way. Like I had always been here, and I would always be here. I tried to tell myself it was just the fatigue settling in. I had been working for hours, and the weight of the long shift was starting to get to me. But it was more than that. There was something about the stillness of the store, the way the shelves stood like silent sentinels, that made it feel wrong. There was no real life in the place. Even the registers were empty, the aisles barren, save for the few items that were supposed to be stocked by the employees. But then, I saw him again. Todd. It was odd how I hadn't noticed him sooner. He had been walking around, his movements slow, deliberate, as though he were trying to blend in with the surroundings. His eyes never met mine directly, always glancing off to the side, as if he were avoiding my gaze. But I could feel his presence, like a shadow hanging over me, never leaving, always there. I turned my head, expecting to find him just out of sight, but he was gone. Again. I told myself it didn't matter. I didn't need to see him to do my job. I didn't need to think about him. The hours would pass, just like they always did. But as I pushed my cart down the aisles, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. There was a strange rhythm to the store at night. The sounds of the hum from the lights, the shuffle of my feet on the linoleum floor, the occasional thud of something heavy falling in the distance. Everything felt like it was on a loop, repeating endlessly, as though the world had become trapped in its own cycle, and there was no escape. I would stock shelves, move down the aisles, adjust the products, and then start over again. It was all very simple, very basic, but it was also suffocating. But then came the moment when everything shifted again. It was subtle at first, like the change in the air when the seasons start to turn. But then it grew, and the sensation of being watched intensified. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no one there. No Todd, no Jeremy, no one. Still, something wasn't right. I turned down an aisle, and there, in the far corner, I saw it. The toy aisle. It was completely empty, save for a single object sitting on the floor. At first, I thought it was just a misplaced doll or a forgotten box of toys, but then I saw it clearly. A mannequin. A lifeless, featureless mannequin, its limbs outstretched as though reaching for something or someone. I stopped in my tracks. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment I wasn't sure what to do. I had seen mannequins before, of course, but this one was different. There was something off about it. The way it stood there, in the dead center of the aisle, was wrong. It shouldn't have been there. I swallowed hard and slowly approached it, my footsteps quiet against the floor. I couldn't understand why I was drawn to it, but something compelled me to go closer. The mannequin was dressed in a faded blue Walmart vest, the same one the employees wore. It was the same uniform Todd had on. It was the same uniform that Jeremy had worn earlier. It didn't make sense. I reached out to touch it, my fingers brushing the stiff material of the vest. That was when I heard the sound. A faint click, like a door closing. But there was no door, no windows, no escape. I froze, my hand still hovering over the mannequin's shoulder. My pulse quickened. The click grew louder, the sound echoing in the empty aisle. My eyes darted to the far end of the store, expecting to see someone, anyone, coming toward me. But there was nothing. Just the endless rows of products, stretching on forever, like a maze with no exit. But then I realized something. The mannequin's eyes, though featureless and blank, had shifted, just the slightest bit. They were looking at me. I pulled my hand away, stumbling backward. My breath caught in my throat, but when I looked again, the mannequin was still motionless, exactly where it had been before. No movement, no sign of life. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing. A trick of the light, perhaps, or my mind playing tricks on me. I had been working too long. I needed to take a break, get some air, shake off the creeping sense of dread that had started to settle in my chest. But then the lights flickered, just for a moment, plunging the store into darkness. My heart leaped into my throat, and I clenched my hands into fists. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, ragged and panicked, but that was all. There was no other noise, no hum of the lights, no shuffle of footsteps, just silence. Then the lights snapped back on, and everything was the same. The mannequin was still there. The aisles were still empty. The store was as it had always been, except it wasn't. The air felt different, heavier, thicker. It pressed down on me like an invisible weight. I turned away from the mannequin, shaking my head, trying to dispel the fear that was rising in me. I told myself it wasn't real. It couldn't be. But then I heard the voice. Rachel. It was faint at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. It came from the darkness, from the corners of the store. It sounded almost familiar, like someone I had known once, long ago. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to look. But my body moved on its own, as though it had no control over its own actions. I glanced down the aisle, and there, at the end of it, was Todd. His back was to me, but this time, his movements were different. He wasn't walking. He was swaying gently, as though caught in the wind. I blinked, and he was gone. I stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do, unsure of what had just happened. Was I hallucinating? Was I imagining things? I didn't know. But as I looked around, the store suddenly felt much larger, much darker, and much more menacing than it had before. But then the bell rang, the faint chime of the door opening, and the store seemed to breathe again, the hum of the lights returning to their regular rhythm. I exhaled sharply, realizing I had been holding my breath, but there was something else now, something I hadn't noticed before. The mannequin. It was gone. I looked around frantically, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no sign of it. The aisle was empty. And that's when I realized I was not alone. The next few hours blurred together in a haze of dull repetition. I shuffled through the aisles, restocking shelves that never seemed to stay full, pushing a cart that felt heavier with every pass. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead became a steady companion, their cold, artificial light casting long, hard shadows across the store. The monotonous rhythm of it all made it impossible to tell how much time had passed. Was it minutes, hours, a lifetime? But something had changed. Something was different now. The air felt thick, suffocating, And it wasn't just from the exhaustion weighing me down. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in. Every aisle seemed narrower, every shelf taller, and every step I took echoed louder than the last. My pulse quickened with each passing minute, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I tried to push it aside, focus on the task at hand, but the unease crept up again. I had seen it, the mannequin. The moment it disappeared, vanished without a trace, something inside me had snapped. A part of me had hoped it was just my imagination, that I was just overworked, tired, and seeing things. But then there was the voice, the whisper that called my name, Rachel. The sound echoed in my mind, like a broken record playing over and over, and I couldn't forget it, no matter how hard I tried. I could still feel the weight of those eyes on me, the coldness of the mannequin's gaze following my every movement. I didn't know how, but I knew it had been watching me. I knew it. I tried to ignore the thought, focus on my work. There was always something else to do in the store. The clock on the wall was ticking, each second dragging by. But then it happened again. The flickering of the lights. A stutter in the rhythm that was so familiar, so constant. I froze mid-step, staring up at the ceiling. For a moment, the store seemed to pulse like it was alive, and I could feel it. Feel the pulse of the building itself, shuddering beneath my feet. The lights flickered once more, longer this time. The hum of the overhead lights seemed to drop in pitch, as if struggling to keep the store lit. It buzzed, sputtered, and then everything went dark. The sudden silence was deafening. I held my breath. The darkness was complete, suffocating. I was standing in the middle of the aisle, my hand frozen on the cart when I heard it. A soft shuffle of footsteps. I whipped around, but there was nothing. No one. I stepped back, my heart thumping painfully in my chest, my eyes scanning the aisles. The darkness felt alive, wrapping around me like a blanket, pressing in on all sides. The stillness was unbearable, and yet I couldn't bring myself to move. I was paralyzed. Then the light snapped back on. I gasped, blinking, my eyes adjusting to the harsh, buzzing light that filled the room. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, that the shadows had played tricks on me. But I knew better now. I had seen it, heard it. I took a slow, shaky breath and forced myself to keep moving. The aisles stretched out in front of me, unchanged, the shelves still stacked high with merchandise, as though nothing had happened at all. But something had happened. The air felt different now, charged with an electricity I couldn't quite place. Every movement I made was echoed back at me by the store, amplified, distorted, as though I wasn't alone. But there was no one there, no one visible. I rounded the corner and froze. Todd. He was standing at the far end of the aisle, staring at me. His face was expressionless, his eyes hollow and distant, like he wasn't really there. He was motionless, a figure in a store that had no life, just like the mannequin. "Hey, Todd," I said, trying to sound casual. My voice sounded foreign in the empty air, and I immediately regretted speaking. His eyes didn't meet mine, but I could feel them. I could feel him watching me, studying me. It was unsettling, but I forced myself to push through it. "Everything all right?" I asked, taking a few steps toward him. He didn't answer. I stopped a few feet away from him, staring at his stiff posture. The silence between us grew longer, like an unbearable weight pressing in from all sides. It was like he was frozen in time, stuck in a moment he couldn't escape. The thought made my skin crawl. I looked around nervously, trying to make sense of everything. The store was the same as it always had been, and yet it wasn't. I took a step back, but then, Rachel. The voice came from somewhere behind me, soft but insistent. My blood ran cold, and I turned quickly, but there was no one there. No Todd, no figure, no mannequin. I was alone. Or at least I thought I was. The chill that ran through my body was not from the air conditioning, not from the sudden drop in temperature. It was something deeper, something primal, instinctive. Something was wrong. I wasn't supposed to be here. I looked at Todd one last time, but he was gone, disappeared. Not a trace, just the fading echo of his presence. I took another step back, my legs trembling, my mind reeling. I could feel something moving around me, something I couldn't see, but I could sense it. It was circling me, watching me. I wanted to leave. I wanted to walk out of the store and never look back. But the exit was so far away, and I didn't trust myself to make it there. I was trapped in this place, stuck in a loop I couldn't escape. I glanced around, trying to keep my bearings. I turned toward the back of the store, hoping to find a way out. But then I saw him again. The mannequin. It was standing in the toy aisle, just as it had been before. But this time, its eyes weren't blank. No, this time, they were staring directly at me. I could feel the gaze like a physical force, pushing me backward, drawing me in. I didn't want to go any closer, but my feet moved of their own accord. I tried to stop myself, tried to run, but it was too late. The mannequin was waiting for me. I took one slow step after another, my breath shallow, the rhythmic pulse of the store keeping time with my heartbeat. Every footstep was loud in the silence. The mannequin stood in the aisle, its featureless face now replaced with something far worse. The eyes were no longer empty. They were watching me, cold, accusing, filled with a knowledge I didn't understand. The world around me shifted again. The lights flickered once more, the shadows deepening, the hum of the store growing louder, more pronounced, more insistent. I reached out a hand, but the mannequin was no longer there. In its place was something else. Something worse. Todd. His face was twisted, contorted, no longer human. The hollow eyes were now filled with something far darker, a gaze that pierced through me, a gaze that held secrets I wasn't meant to know. And then, as if on cue, the room shifted once more, and I was surrounded. I was no longer alone. The mannequins were moving, the people were moving, and they were all staring at me. The lights went out, and I was left in the darkness, alone. If you've made it this far, you know this story is just beginning, and the terror isn't over yet. If you want to keep exploring the darkness and uncover what happens next, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the next chapter in this chilling journey. And don't forget to drop a comment below. Let me know what you think, share your theories, and if you've experienced anything strange like this, I want to hear your stories. Stay safe, and remember, sometimes the things we ignore are the things we should fear the most. See you in the next one.